Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Okereke, as Lisa said. I'm a PhD student here, and I'm also part of the Reinvent project. One thing that I also do, which will kind of explain why I'm excited about this panel, is that I am the founder and editor of a publication that's called Minority Africa, which covers minorities on the continent. And so I've spent the last few years trying to build a distinct news identity. And I think that has worked. I was looking a few days ago while I was working on a report at the very first thing that I put down when I was going to start. I was 20 years old in 2018. You know how old I am now. But I was 20 years old in 2018, and I was scoping this publication out, and I put down things like objectivity and all this really nice words. And then I was thinking back, and I'm actually, this is a kind of different direction from where we've gone. And that, made me very, very curious about how people actually form identities on social media and digitally. And I'm very excited to be having the conversation with Tara of COURIER Newsroom, which launched the same year as we did, and which we're a huge fan of, as well as Phil from WCVB. So I know we're between you and lunch, so we'll kind of do a quick 5-minute intro from each of them, and then we'll kind of dive into having a conversation and then take some questions at the end. Okay?
Thank you, everyone. And Mike, thank you for putting this together and for inviting a room full of people who I respect and know, and this just makes it harder to say anything. I just wanted to start with 3 slides very quickly, because as we're talking about the future, I've always been taught that it's useful to remember a couple of things about the past. I wonder if anyone recognizes this picture or may have seen the 1981 package. It's on YouTube in 100 different places, but you go to a conference, you probably have seen it a couple times before. And it's about the first website for a San Francisco newspaper, and how it took all morning to download, and these guys in a cubbyhole underneath the stairs who asked you 3 questions before you can go through the door, they were entering it into the system. And I remember my first jobs, decades later, being in a cubbyhole under the stairs and entering it into the system. And the question was, why did it take so long to begin to evolve? Then it did evolve. There was a business, internet broadcasting, and it's now been rolled into that company and then into this company and then into that company again. But they thought that they would do a different digital brand for all of these legacy television stations. So there was the BostonChannel.com, which is now back to being WCVB.com and where I work, and you should all look it up. But there were others all over the country. And I also worked for the DenverChannel.com before they were finally able to change it back. That company's not around anymore. And the question that we should ask, and that I think a lot of people have asked over time, is did those brandings help or hurt? And maybe that's an open question. But they don't use those brands anymore, and maybe there's an implication of an answer. So to me, this is a very clumsy visual metaphor. If you're coming from a legacy standpoint, different than an entrepreneurship of a new platform, what did you start out with? What do people know you for? What pieces of it are your foundation that you want to keep? And then what can you do new to paint in between those lines? And to me, when you're talking about building a digital brand for the future, if you're coming from a place of legacy, whether it's newspaper, television, or radio, magazine, anything else, the question to me is, what do you need to keep? What made you you, or your organization into what it is, your program into what it is, and how do you build that going forward with the adaptations that are required by the new platform, the new audience?
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Caleb, and Katie, who was the first to invite me to this. I'm so excited to be here. As a former journalism student, my favorite extracurricular thing to do is come speak to journalism students in schools. So my very first job, paid job, in college was at my local free weekly newspaper in Newport, Rhode Island, the Mercury. And I absolutely loved it. I got to do so many fun, really cool cultural things and write about them and get paid to do it. I thought it was a dream. I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. And then I went into national media at 60 Minutes and CBS Evening News and Frontline, and I learned a lot of amazing things, made a bunch of incredible connections and had mentorships and everything, and also felt at that time, which I started at CBS in 2005, I want to say, that they were already falling very fast behind the curve. Very, very fast. They weren't actually adopting social media or saw it as an important or relevant distribution channel. They were nowhere near even thinking about packaging the content for other distribution channels at that stage. And it felt really strange to me, being in journalism school, working there and interning there before I worked there full time, and folks not even having a conversation about how the internet was changing everything about journalism and everything about people, how they were consuming information. And now fast forward, 10 years later, that's still a challenge in a lot of our industry. I took a real strong pivot out of journalism after covering the 2008 election into politics. I became one of the sort of foremost digital strategists in the Democratic Party and progressive movement. I did that for about 10 years and was frustrated in a different way about how sort of the values aligned groups and party that I was excited to work on behalf of was also really behind the curve in terms of how to communicate with folks and meet them where they are. And it's something I'm very sympathetic to, because we had industries that worked really, really well at communicating to the general public with good, incredibly integrity-driven journalism, independent and otherwise. And yet the internet changed all of that. Social media changed all of that. And these industries have been really slow to adapt for a lot of different reasons that everyone in here knows very well and have been discussed and will be. And so I sort of paired these different experiences and thought really long and hard about something that I wanted to create that didn't. And that ended up being COURIER ultimately. And I want to give a lot of grace to folks that are trying to evolve legacy media and traditional media, broadcast, print, radio, what have you, for the way that people really consume information today and for our very, very inundated and short attention spans, because that really does dictate how do we consume all of the information coming at us. How do we self-select now because we can? The democratization of information is amazing, and yet also it has completely upended the industry and frankly our democracy, because we know that good information and access to it is the lifeblood of keeping a democracy in this country. And that's why it's at threat right now, because all of our good information industries have not caught up. And unfortunately, bad actors and folks that don't uphold facts and quality information have been first movers on platforms where information spreads more quickly. So I wanted to create a platform and a media company and a network of newsrooms that did things entirely differently from the get-go, which is still very difficult, but easier in some ways than trying to retrofit old media. And so I hope to be able to bring some of the insights we've learned, but everybody who has heard of COURIER in some way, shape, or form in the room? Okay, a good amount of folks. So just really briefly on it, and I think we'll get into more details, but COURIER is both a local news network. We have newsrooms with reporters and social media correspondents on the ground in 11 states now. Not in Massachusetts, unfortunately, or my home state of Rhode Island. The closest one we have is New Hampshire, which actually just launched about a year and a half ago, called Granite Post. But we focus entirely on reaching what we call news-avoidant Americans, which is the majority of the population today. People who do not pay through paywalls and never will. People who don't watch cable news or listen to talk radio, but who passively get their news by scrolling social media in their inboxes. So we have trained reporters, both young reporters as well as legacy print reporters, to be news content creators, to be the faces and voices breaking down complicated issues, political reporting, cultural and local reporting in video explainers on TikTok and Instagram, through infographics and carousels, and headlines, because that's how folks are consuming information today. It's much more of a volume game. We also are very transparent about our values. I believe objectivity was always a bit of an illusion. And I really think that actually the reason that so many folks don't trust traditional or legacy media anymore is because they don't know what they stand for. And I think it's actually more easy now to build trust and build trusted audiences when you're very transparent about your values and what you stand for and where you come from, and you let people make a decision about that. That is obviously a very contentious debate in certain circles in journalism, and one I'm very, very happy to have with folks, because I think that there's merits on both sides of it. But I made the decision to start a very values-driven organization that would be transparent about their values, that would bring reporters and creators in who share those values, and that we would never hide the ball on that and let people make a call for themselves, but we would also never compromise facts, truth, and we would certainly never do anything that would intentionally divide, which I think we see a lot in partisan media on the right in this country, which sometimes we get very unfairly compared to simply because we have explicit values. And then the last thing is that we have a civic mission. We exist intentionally to increase informed voter turnout and civic participation in this country, because that's how we keep a democracy. We never tell people who to vote for, but we tell people where they stand on the issues they care about, and we intentionally target audiences who don't vote regularly or at all, especially younger folks, to make sure they have the information they need to be inspired, motivated, and informed to go out and vote. And that's how we measure our success, is are we getting more people to participate in local, state, and federal elections? Because that's what we believe is the most important role of journalism in society, and something that we want to preserve. So thank you all so much for having me.
Awesome. I'll actually start out with you first, Tara. And I think that you've, I was listening this week to your episode on the Politics Girl podcast, and you talked about, again, same things you mentioned, objectivity, transparency, but also this kind of like, need to focus on particularly what your audience needs, right? And I think we hear a lot of that in like, people say, oh, like we're doing audience first journalism, but sometimes it seems like audience last and then like analytics on top of the audience. But for you, and like in your building of COURIER, like how does the perspective of the audience actually influence your day-to-day strategy, right? So you had this premise about the audience before you started. You have done it for 5 years now. What has changed, and how have you inculcated those kind of like lessons from your audience into your day-to-day?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's a pretty broad audience, right, that we cared about. But it's one that has been disproportionately left behind by media that has ended up behind paywalls, which is where, unfortunately, most of local journalism, at least online, is trapped. And so we didn't actually know too much about them outside of that, and the correlation to the fact that folks who don't access in news proactively vote at a lower propensity, right? That's pretty much what we knew about it. So we had to learn a lot. We're a very data-driven organization. From my background working in politics, I learned how to be pretty targeted and surgical on the advertising side. Those were invaluable skills in understanding how these massive information distribution platforms work, how you have to pay your way into people's news feeds and algorithms. And so I took those skills, and we brought that kind of those capabilities into the newsroom in order to really throw a lot at them, right? Throw a lot at the audiences, and then look and saw what did they engage with. Which stories did they actually click on and were willing to sign up for our newsletter to be able to access for free, because we'll never charge for our local reporting, and then give them more of that. So there is a continuous, constant feedback loop happening in our organization about what our audience engages with and what they want, and what we then deliver more of. And now we've taken it to a new level where it's not just increasing reporting on food, or state history. Our audiences love state history facts and trivia, which we would not have assumed, right? But now it has evolved to actually looking at this massive data set that we've compiled in each of our states, and being able to now pilot new products, new newsletter products, new podcast, YouTube series, TikTok series, be able to identify local creators that have an expertise in a certain issue area, or something like astrology, or make their own tequila in Arizona, and be able to actually pilot new serial-driven content that's very talent-focused, to give our audiences even more deeper content and deeper ways to engage with our brands through those products. And I think this is a really important point, because I think all media has moved into talent-driven products. I think local is always the slowest, but we've seen this in national media, right? With big prominent journalists leaving legacy brands to start their own Substacks or their own YouTube channels or podcasts. and be able to make actually a lot more money than the slides you saw before if they're successful. So products are better to monetize, but they're also better at building trusted communities. Like, people are coming because they really want what you're giving them. And having a sort of collective of products under a brand, I think, is a more effective strategy today than sort of homepage reporting or assignments of reporting as we've had traditionally in digital media.
That's great. I think there's like the very crucial thing about what you're sort of putting out is that there's a strong nexus between like audiences and like trusting you vis-a-vis what you're actually providing them. And I'm trying to feel, which I think one very interesting thing about the history of WCVB is that, you know, it's always been like an outlier from the start, right? And so it had this like commitment to like, you know, create local content, focus on local communities, even though like, you know, that didn't always like align with like corporations or whatever. And so I'm curious now, how has it been, I guess, enacting some of that identity in like a digital space, right? And you've walked across a breadth of local news organizations, but what does it look like on a day-to-day?
Yeah, I mean, it is community values at the core of what WCVB is about. We see a lot of overlap to some of the topical areas that Tara has said. And, the idea of pride in place, right, has been a decades-long part of what it is to be at Channel 5 and what it is to be with my friends from Chronicle, which is our magazine program parallel to the newsroom. But when it comes to digital, my metaphor is that you've got to feed broccoli and ice cream, right? And you can give ice cream. And there are a lot of people in this business who say, oh, I see some ice cream. I see some ice cream. Let's put it out. Let's put it out. And eventually, if you do that, all you're going to become is fat. And you can't just be the ice cream guy all the time, right? You've got to feed some broccoli. Now, the things that we're talking about learning from the audience, having them teach us through the data, through the technology, that's about how to make broccoli taste sweeter. And that's how we can take things that might be boring and isolate what is the interesting fact in this, right? It is our duty to have who, what, when, where, why, and how in the story, right? That's what we owe them. But is there some part of that that's more interesting, more grabby, more attention-getting than the others? And if that's the case, how do we sculpt that to the top, right? And when you're talking about the entrepreneurship of sculpting a new newsletter or sculpting a new newsroom in a new state, it's a similar process, just larger, right? And in our newsroom, you know, we've had the pleasure of working with this project and saying, well, that video worked or that video didn't work, and we liked this version, we didn't like that version. And the idea that these things were being applied and then studied and given some statistics and rigorousness, that's very appealing to me, because that's what we try to do as a small team, my digital team. We're seeing the real-time analytics. We're seeing what the audience is telling us in response. And I think that all the other parts of our organization can learn something from that too. Because if it's about dragging people from one point to another point to another point through a newscast, but we're not responding to what they want, then we're leaving a piece of our toolkit unused, untouched, in the bag, never unwrapped. And so I think there's a feedback loop in both directions.
And just to piggyback off that, do you find that people are resistant to, like, I guess those kind of like really strong like innovative ideas in like legacy traditional media?
That's a great question. It depends on the person. There are people and there are organizations that are resistant to change, absolutely. But then there are other people you meet who you sit down and you say, I'm sorry, that just wasn't weird enough. And every organization is going to have a mix of people. The question to me as a leader of a small team is, what things is person A capable of trying, and person B, what are they capable of trying, and how do you encourage them to take those leaps of faith and say, as long as your principles are good, as long as you're staying on the road of the good journalism, the service of the audience, putting the audience first and not ourselves first, right, then I think that we can drive forward, whether we're driving at 50 or 10, not every project has the same success.
Yeah, I think you're raising very crucial points about, I guess, the malleability of journalism. I think people tend to think about journalism as this thing that's rigid and can't evolve, but we've seen it move in different directions historically, right? And it kind of has to continue to, which I guess brings me to something I was thinking about earlier for you, Tara. And the previous panel talked about process journalism, which I find to be very fascinating. And it seems like that connects very well with transparency, which seems to be one of the core values of COURIER Newsroom. Can you tell me, or tell us precisely, how you're being transparent about your processes, what that looks like when you actually put it into practice?
Sure. And when you say processes, do you mean in terms of sourcing, reporting, traditional sort of journalistic process? Sure. So we started a pretty disruptive company, and we started it with the intention of not actually starting. We started with what do you keep, but it was a very short list, and it was fact checking, basic standards and practices in terms of integrity, and then the transparency of our values and our investors and our structure. And so, but everything else was very much let's try things that have never been done. And one of the biggest challenges, which piggybacking off what you said, Phil, is that you have to reprogram reporters, even young ones in some respects that have come out of journalism schools more recently that have been really programmed based on the old model of journalism and media consumption habits, and they don't want to do anything they perceive as wrong or biased or things of that nature. And so we spend a lot of time encouraging and celebrating and incentivizing our reporters and our teams to get more connected to their audiences personally. They are the brands. And whenever you really help people understand the why, it makes it a lot easier. And, we can show folks, right, how the traditional and legacy media industries are dying and losing audiences and what's happening in the vacuum of good information in the country, but also what professional development looks like, where reporters have to be their own brands. They have to be building their own audiences. They need to think about audiences. And something in a lot of traditional journalism and media spaces that has been hard to reprogram is that there was not only church and state between revenue and editorial, but also between audience development and editorial. And so we really had to, and still do, have to work with our reporters and our creators around how they, don't you want folks to consume your content? 5 years ago, it started with don't write a long article, no one's gonna read it. Don't you want people to read it that aren't just your peers? That was a really hard habit to break because, they take it personally, right? They're like, I'm such a good writer. This is such a good story. This is such an important story. It's but if nobody reads it, doesn't matter. Because we don't exist just to win press awards, right? We exist to inform the public. And so that helped us move them into the headlines and the videos and the short form skimmable concepts. The same way elite models are moving that way, like Axios, right? Skimmable. I love that I know it's gonna take me 3 minutes to read my morning newsletter from Axios because I don't have time or the attention span to spend on longer form. And so that helped. And then it really turned, now we're at the process of teaching them about building their own brands and audiences. If for no other reason than if we get shut down by an Elon Musk lawsuit, which is highly probable no matter what media organization you are, if you're out there to tell the facts, then we have a distributed network of people who can continue to communicate to their audiences. And so we have some of the standards and practices and processes of a traditional newsroom, but decreasingly so because folks are leaning into themselves. And the other thing I want to mention is to hearken to something that one of my mentors and journalism professors, Jay Rosen, who folks might know from NYU, because he's been very vocal against both sidesism in journalism and things of that nature. But he talks about a a point of view from somewhere, and a voice from somewhere instead of a voice from nowhere. So that transition from trying to abandon who you are or your political persuasions or your experiences, your personal life experiences, etc. That sort of traditional model of abandoning those to just do straight fact reporting into bringing that into your reporting and your work and using that to cultivate more audience and community and trust. And so that's part of our process, and we're actually about to scale sort of the internal IP we've created at COURIER that seems to be pretty unique in the ecosystem to build out what we're calling a news creator training core, to be able to bring some of the fact-checking, sourcing, integrity, standards and practices into creators, because creators now are the trusted messengers and the newsmakers and the news distributors. And most of them never thought of themselves or would think of themselves as journalists or reporters. But community reporting is, I believe, the present and future of local news and local reporting. And so how do we help bolster their ability to make sure that they don't spread misinformation or disinformation accidentally, so that they feel well sourced, that they can source back to good source material to the communities that they are trusted by.
I think that's very interesting, Tara, and I'm really thinking about personality as you kind of talk about it, and feel, because I know that like legacy media has had a hard time trying to like have news reporters build independent identities outside of the newsroom, right? And the Washington Post has been a good example of people who I think, and the TikTok team is here tomorrow for a keynote, but I think they're a really good example of people who have been able to kind of build independent identities from the newsroom. And so I'm curious from you, one, what is it like in WCVB as regards like personal branding versus station branding? And then why do you think legacy media continues to remain reluctant to kind of let reporters build their own identity outside of the newsroom?
Oh, that's very complicated. And there are people who will try to pursue that. So the first hurdle that people need to jump over is their own comfort. How comfortable are you putting yourself out there? And one example is, for most of my career, my team didn't put our own bylines on things, right? It was the staff, Channel 5 staff, Channel 7 staff, whatever it was. And that was because one of the premises was, who knows me from a hole in the ground, right? I'm just a guy. And it's interesting, since we've decided as an organization that bit of transparency is part of our values. We've begun putting bylines on everything, and sometimes numerous bylines, because the story is not just touched by one person. And suddenly I find people discovering me in other ways, and because they couldn't figure out how to email me at work, they're finding me on LinkedIn. And that's not what I'm personally going for. There are people out there who it is what they're going for. And I want to applaud them. I want to encourage them to do that. But it's all about the balancing act, right? If we're all there to work toward the same goal, right, which is getting News Center 5, getting Chronicle in front of as many people as possible, as long as we're not diverting to go off on me track, I think there's room for it. I look at what is on TikTok, what is on Shorts, what is on Reels, and there are things in there that I believe have roots in broadcast. Right? There are things in there that could come back to broadcast. There are things to learn from one another. In television, for example, there are absolutely cults of personality for certain people. There are absolutely people who have been there and developed their audience, their resonance with that community for so long that they make a difference. Absolutely. When they're out on vacation for a week, you get calls, right? Because people associate them with you.
Broadcasters are the original creators.
Right.
I mean, they really are, right? Like, people knew their local broadcasters and their weather men and women. Yeah.
So it's not a succinct answer to your question. I'm sorry. There are people who will go that route, and I think we can encourage them to do that in the right ways. the fundamental question is still what unites us in our effort. And if you can do that without going off our road, I think that there's absolutely room for it. As the husband of someone who is an on-air personality, there is also a question of, I think we have to acknowledge as managers, who owns that personality? And there's loads of discomfort among the staff about who owns that personality. And those questions vary, the answer to those questions vary by company. Sometimes within the company they vary by newsroom. They vary by local laws or contracts. And those are not easy things to answer. I can tell you it has absolutely been a point of contention in different places that I've worked over the years in different states. And it's just not one single answer. But when a person is truly beloved in their community, their voice matters. And regardless of where you put their voice, it's going to make an impact. And honestly, if you have that person in your organization, spread it out. And if you strive to be that person in your organization, find the people you can pair up with who already have that clout. Learn from them, get introduced by them, and begin to build that up if that individuality is going to be a part of your personal goal.
That's great. Thank you, Phil. I'm going to open up for questions in a little bit, but I have kind of two final curious questions. And Tara, I think you've talked about your newsroom being values-driven, right? Which is a tag I find very interesting, because then the question is, what are these values? And you've hinted at some of them, which are, transparency, positionality, letting people build a brand identity. But I'm very curious about what the other values are, like what values underpin the newsroom, and how do you think that is helping perhaps rebuild trust?
Sure, yeah. We have a whole host of them. They're listed on every single one of our newsroom websites. We believe in reproductive rights and freedom for all Americans with no exception. We believe in LGBTQ plus rights. We believe climate change is an urgent crisis. We believe authoritarianism is here and very dangerous and will harm all communities in this country. So we're really explicit about our values across the board. And we do not see those as political. And this one is where it just gets a little bit weedier, and it's a good and rich debate. But, legacy media actually, in a lot of ways, has done a disservice by painting the country as red and blue, Republican or Democrat, and as increasing polarization. So the word progressive means something different to almost everyone, I would guess, if I asked in this room. And what is often described by legacy media or mainstream media as progressive positions or values are actually popular positions held by the vast majority of the population in the country. And so we hold positions that are popular amongst over 60 to 70% of Americans when you break it down actually into a political or policy space. And so that's why I call us values-driven and not partisan, because we don't carry water for Democrats or the Democratic Party as we get framed as doing. We represent the values of the vast majority of Americans and our audiences. And we know that if they know where candidates and elected officials, their local leaders, stand on the issues that matter to them, like protecting Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, that is going to influence their level of engagement. And that's why we're very proudly and transparently values-driven.
That's great. And I'm curious about something else, which is just a personal interest. But I'm working this first of my PhD here on AI in media strategies. And so, what ways is your newsroom using AI, if at all? And what possibilities do you see?
Sure. So I think every newsroom, every business, every industry needs to be integrating AI in certain ways. I think it's coming. So it's like, how do you want to leverage it? We have a very clear policy that we made in partnership with our editorial teams around AI. So we will never publish a piece of content that doesn't disclaim that AI was used in it, if it was. And for the most part, the only real work that we have done with AI has been on piloting an experiment to be able to scrape a lot of city, town, local, and state level information that is buried on really archaic government websites and agency websites and things of that nature, to pull it in and turn it into stories and digestible language that then can be turned into multimedia content, so we can get that information accessible to more people through our audiences. So we do that, and we transparently disclose that we use AI tools in that process. I was on a call this morning with some members of my team that wanted permission to experiment with some AI tools to paraphrase other local reporting in their state, because we see another big value proposition of ours is aggregating and distributing other good local reporting that is not behind a paywall, that is open source, but to get it in front of audiences on social media sites that are not going to access it otherwise, and to credit it appropriately. And so they wanted to not rewrite other journalists' words and see if they could paraphrase using AI and disclose that. So those are the different ways that the editorial teams are experimenting. And then internally, our finance team uses AI tools to do a lot of efficiency work around budgeting and accounting. So we've started to try to integrate it throughout the whole organization to not fall behind the curve, since it's quickly. But the tools are all still in various levels of utility, and they're getting smarter by the day. And so we do encourage all of our teams to be hands-on, though, so they can really work with the computer learning element of it, because the tools get better the more time you spend teaching them. And so that is a commitment of time.
Absolutely. They get much better the more you use them. I like this constantly like a human in the loop. I'm curious similarly for you, Phil, about the same question. And I looked at WCVB's policy and just this brief line, and it said, we'll use AI, but it will never replace a journalist, and a journalist will always be in the loop. But how does that look like in practice in the newsroom?
Ernie can help answer this question if you want to talk about the policy. But for me, I guess as in childhood, I read a lot of science fiction, and the AI here is very disappointing to me. And I think, honestly, it's completely mislabeled. I really do. I think that what we're talking about as AI is not what it was. Yeah, and I'm not sure I wish for it either. But the idea of an agent that can accomplish a little task for you, I do embrace, and I use many times a day. What are those little tasks? Yes, scraping some data. Yes, reformatting data that somebody sent in a ridiculous PDF that you just can't copy and paste, and you need to reformat because otherwise it would take me 16 steps. Absolutely. Reformatting. You're checking it. You're doing the work to make sure it's right. Pulling out all the proper nouns from an article you just spent 2 hours writing so that you can do your keywords more quickly. Little steps like that are where AI is of great value in my workday, because the demands on all of us, right? We're here to talk about expanding what we do. The demands don't get smaller. How do you do these things more efficiently? How can AI help identify some boringly presented newsletter or press release that might be of interest because it correlates to some piece of analytical data that we have? But little tasks. And I don't want to read, as a consumer, that organization that replaces my colleagues, not just because they're my colleagues or my peers, but because I don't trust AI yet enough to let it be a peer. And I don't trust it enough. I don't trust Facebook with its algorithm, right? And I haven't, right? Not our friend, not our friends. They have an agenda that is not necessarily our agenda, right? Venn diagrams for all of these things. Overlap, but not alignment. So to me, AI has some value, poorly named, and more importantly, it's what things can you use tool set wise to get faster. I have a family member who works in grocery. They've used machine learning to help order how many apples they need in the next truckload for a lot longer than we've been willing to accept. This is the same tool. It's the same tool. So how do we make it work now with letters and words instead of apples? And it does help with little jobs.
That's fascinating. We have some time for questions, so I'm just going to open it up for questions. Yes.
Can you talk about the future of content discovery and algorithmic discovery should TikTok go away? Because TikTok has really revolutionized how you can access your audience you don't need a following, you don't need to pay, but the other platforms are much, much different. So can you talk about what the future looks like should TikTok go away?
Could you repeat the question so we can all hear?
Sure. So the question was, what will happen if TikTok goes away in terms of content discovery, right? Because the open algorithm model that TikTok has pioneered that has been so successful doesn't rely anymore on people following you, right? They're serving the content based on engagement and based on preferences, and really curating your For You page, if you will, for content that you want to see. And the other platforms have been behind the curve on that. So one, I don't think under the Trump regime, TikTok is going away anytime soon. I would place a good bet that it sticks around. Doesn't mean that it's going to be safe. I don't know if I'd rather it be in the Trump regime's hands or China. It's kind of a real, it's one and the same in some ways. Sorry, I can't prevent my own personal opinions coming out ever since I was a child. The other thing is that there is an arms race to be able to replicate what TikTok has built and to expand on it, especially at Meta. That's basically all Zuckerberg and his team have been focused on, is how to compete with TikTok and open up the algorithm. And so they have been tweaking that, and so I think that we will see that. But also, as we know, TikTok was. I have been working in digital media and politics for so long now that it's like I remember exactly when each new platform came on, and like TikTok was not relevant in 2020, and it was the most important platform for information distribution for a huge swath of the population in 2024. We have no idea what the platform that's going to be the most powerful information distribution system is right now. I definitely imagine it is going to be built on AI. And I think that the algorithms are going to get even smarter. I also think that AI is going to be used to create much more curated experiences, because we're suddenly reaching once again the point of oversaturation and inundation where like, how many streaming apps can you pay for a month? How many Substacks can you sign up for a month, or newsletters in general? And so I do think that it's going to continue. We're going to have more tools and platforms that customize even more. So I think what TikTok did was profound, obviously, and really shook up the whole industry. And I just think it's just scratching the surface of what we're going to see in terms of curated experiences, for better and for worse.
Great. Oh.
My question was for you, Tara. What is your response to the values being political? What is your response to both sidesism? Who decides what is political and what isn't, and what can or can't be shown or talked about in a newsroom, whether it's legacy media or digital media?
Whew. So, I mean, I am just somebody whose belief system is that, like, if you don't care about politics, it doesn't matter, because politics cares about you, because everything is political. Right? The air we breathe, the food we eat, the schools our kids can attend, what that education looks like, what kind of healthcare we can get, if we're treated as a person, if we're respected for our identity. All of it comes down to choices made by elected officials right now, and soon to be unelected officials in this country. So I do have a really, really hard time with the clinging amongst some news organizations and editorial teams to this false idea that objectivity is going to increase trust and engagement. And I think I think that ideal system is why we are in the position we're in right now as a country, where we won't, literally, freedom of the press is on the line. And so I think that it is way past the point in time where we have to stop ascribing partisan political party terms to values and ideas and issues that impact every single one of us, and get beyond that and get off that high horse and start really understanding that this is about human rights and civil rights and social and racial justice and issues that impact all of us. And it's really about what society do we want to live in, and what do we really see our job as journalists and publishers and editors. Because I know that people get into journalism for the right reasons. We get into journalism to speak truth to power, to hold power accountable, regardless of what your personal or political values are. And the current dominant journalism industry failed at that quite miserably. So I think we just have to do things differently.
Related to that, sorry, Phil, I'm going to take a little stab at WCVB. In traditional media, the both sides-ism, I would say, is a product of being, accountable to your advertisers versus your audience. And in Tara, in your situation, values-driven organization, I heard you say investors. So how do you plan for longevity with a values-driven organization, I guess is my question.
Did you want to respond to the hit?
There are, and it's going to be like a little West Side Story going on. I have a journalism degree. I also have a philosophy degree. And if you're doing the right thing for the wrong reason, is it still the right thing? Right? So these are questions that there's not going to be an answer, and there will be even degrees. There are things that we'll absolutely agree on that both organizations could do. Being transparent about how you got the information, I think we're absolutely going to agree, even though our organization does strive to present all sides, right? Not just both. So I guess my point is, maybe I'm just a really poor, dumb optimist. If you're doing the right thing because you care about your community, there's some value in there that you can still make the most of.
And I think my perspective is, what's the point if you're doing the wrong thing for the right reason? Right? If you're not actually reaching and informing folks, but you are getting, some ad revenue, et cetera, right? It comes down to the value system. But it is true, and I have a lot of sympathy for a lot of traditional media, that you have to be able to stay in business. So as a segue to your question, right, COURIER would not exist if I did not approach values-driven billionaires and millionaires and bring them the case that it's like, look at the media industry, look what's happening here. This is not going to be a profitable venture, nor do I want it to be, and I have no intention, that is not my background or my incentive system, is to build a profitable company, but I need to build a sustainable company to be able to keep doing the work that we do. And so a big part of my argument to my seed investors and my donors is that I am always going to need to rely in part on philanthropic investment, because I do not believe in this country, especially because of who owns the distribution platforms for most of the information, be it traditional or digital and online and social media, that we live in a disinformation economy. You're rewarded by salacious content that is free. And so we have trapped good content for paying consumers, which are the most educated, most wealthy, and often most white audiences in this country. And so I have made the strong case that, like in other countries, if we want to be able to provide free, good journalism, it has to meet people where they are, it has to be in formats they're actually going to consume, and it has to be subsidized by mission-driven philanthropy. And that it isn't a startup investment that then is going to either show a return or that they're not going to be on the hook to do. And especially now where we're facing state-owned media and state-run media only, and fear and favor amongst legacy media with this administration, I think I really do believe that there need to just be more better billionaires, and there needs to be absolutely no criticism, because you can look at the investors of any company and you cannot say with confidence that they had no bearing whatsoever on any of the decisions. Not to say that they're in editorial meetings, but what's going to make money for the company absolutely impacts what you cover and how you cover it, or what you don't cover. And so that's where I say that objectivity is a fallacy, because editorial decisions are always influenced in some part by the business models and where the money comes from. And I'm very proud to have created a company where nobody ever tells me what to report on or what not, because we started with a shared set of values and a shared objective. And the only challenge is that we do not have We do not have folks like Elon Musk who can spit $1 billion at something. And so we do have to figure out how to also diversify and bring in traditional revenue. And it is harder. I'll be really honest. We can't get private sector brand partnerships because we're seen as too hot, right? Or too political. And so it is where we need to lean on more foundations and individuals with wealth who want to see and protect a democracy in this country. So it's a different set of challenges.
I just wanted to add for the record, and for the students in this room, you can and you deserve to be choosy about where you're going to go work. And if you find a company that maybe is the subject of your nightmares, don't go work there, right? I have a very interesting and very uncommon job. I attend marketing meetings and I attend editorial meetings. But I have never, in any of the companies that I've chosen to work for, because I learned pretty quick from the first company, right? But in the companies that I have chosen to work for, I have never been told you can or cannot report a thing, ever. Not even because of an advertiser, not even because of a personal feeling. That's just not the place where I would put myself. And so you, as students, have every right to choose that. And you can choose the value set of your organization that you want to go be associated with, because we were talking earlier about personal brands. That association means something for your self-esteem, for your self-worth, not to mention your career. And you can make those choices.
That's great. Awesome.
I was just going to add, actually, to what Phil just said. You took the words right out of my mouth. I think I love that COURIER just puts it out there. Here's what we believe. I think that we're all kidding ourselves by thinking that that any news organization is totally biased. And if you think about both sides journalism or how we were taught as journalists, it left out people probably like me, right? African American women. I'm a child of immigrants. So we have to remember which sides were being presented. I'll stand up. Which sides were being presented and which ones are still presented. I think the way that legacy media gets around that is you have to look at who they're hiring. Every company that has ever recruited me, the first thing I do, to Phil's point, is I go on their websites and I look at who is in leadership at those companies. And if I see a slew of people who don't look like me, it's not that I'm saying I only want to work with people who look like me. That is not true. What I'm saying is, if I see a diversity of people, that tells me that the conversations that are going to happen in that newsroom, you're going to get multiple perspectives. Adriana knows we're on those editorial calls together. She and I have different perspectives than some people in our newsroom. Or people will say, oh my gosh, the CTA, which is the Chicago Transit Authority, it's so dangerous. And did you hear this? I'm like, I take it every single day. I don't know what you guys are talking about, but we need those different perspectives in a newsroom. It can't just be a bunch of people who live in the suburbs and are wealthy covering news in Chicago, right? I mean, so I would say do your research, because I found as someone who recruits a lot of people, you guys, the young people who I'm trying to hire, you're interviewing me as much as I'm interviewing you. So people will say, what's your newsroom like? What's your work-life balance like? What's this like? I wish I asked those questions as a 20-something-year-old. So I would say, yeah, do that research, because no organization's ever going to be perfect, but the more voices that are in the room, and not just at the lower level. I look at leadership at Hearst. I did the same thing when I worked at Hearst. I did the same thing when I worked at ABC. And if I don't see enough people that I feel like are going to add to the perspective there, I don't go. So, and I know we don't all have those economic abilities to make that decision, but that's truly important to me. I'm not going to work somewhere that I don't feel is going to invest in the things that I think are important, or that I think we should be covering, or that isn't including the voices that have been left out of these conversations for years and years.
That's great. We'll take one more question.
I'd love your perspective on both of you guys, if you have time to comment.
Just one more. Yes, the last one. Great.
Seconding everything Neko said, just one question for Tara. Are you hiring?
Yes, we are.
Now the real question. So I really like your everything you've said so far, but I'm just curious, as Neko has already mentioned, there are a lot of people in legacy media that do care. about our communities, about society, and about covering things correctly and whatnot. I'm just wondering, like, do you have like maybe like a top takeaway that, I don't know, for people that work in traditional media of like how could we move on?
Absolutely, and I do not disparage local and legacy media at all. It's where I was trained and learned, and I think it's also so important, and it's critical that it evolves more quickly. So I would say, especially to younger folks, in the beginning stages of their career, if they choose to go into a traditional newsroom that is doing some things differently, be the change maker, right? Bring your perspective to the table, and not just, where you come from background-wise, race, gender, what have you, but also how you consume information. Be the user too, right? And I'm not just saying like, oftentimes this is the challenge actually, is that reporters do not have the shared life experiences as some of their audiences, so they can fall out of touch with it. But I actually think traditional media has got to evolve their reporting styles and formats very rapidly in order just to reach more audiences and inform them, and then figure out how to bring them into the other funnels that their revenue models are based on. But not to be afraid to be the one who brings new ideas and pushes them in the newsroom and tries them. It will not surprise that anyone in this room, I've been a disruptor since I was an intern, and you find out really quickly who's game to keep you and actually like encourage you and let you try things and let them learn from you, and who's not. Because I left many jobs very quickly where it was like, I cannot have these arguments anymore. Literally one person when I quit a job said, "Good luck with the whole Facebook thing," and like rolled his eyes. He's still in that same job. I run a massive company now. I don't know, but I would just encourage that. And also, and it's not easy economically by any means, but there are a lot of foundations focused on trying to save and evolve local media in particular. But if you have a big idea, I really encourage folks to be entrepreneurial, because we need new models. And it was very lonely starting COURIER. It still is in certain respects, because I tried a lot of different hard things at once. Values-driven, local, digital, scalable. But we just need so many more folks who have great ideas and great instincts to build their own. Even if you just start small with an Instagram feed or a newsletter in your community, like this is, I believe, the future of local journalism, and it's going to come from individuals who have these ideas and these instincts and the will and the scrappiness to do it on their own. And if you can do that while you're working another job, then I think that's what I would encourage to add to the job conversation.
I think the one thing I just wanted to add to that is we talk a lot in this world about content creators, and I always want to be something more like a content engineer. I want to be more intentional, more thoughtful, learn, react, respond, and in that way make something that's functional. Make each article functional, make the people I work with more functional, to build and grow and amplify in the right ways.
Thanks, Phil. Just one final thing before we go. We're in a room full of journalists, we're living in unprecedented times, and so I want to hear from both of you. Last words. What do you think is the most important thing for us to do right now? As journalists, as content engineers, as content creators, as entrepreneurs of newsrooms. What's, in your perspective, the most important thing that we should do right now? Tara, you want to start?
Challenge every single piece of conventional wisdom you hear. We do not live in conventional times. The norms that used to exist no longer apply, and I mean that in everything. I mean it in government, I mean it in media, I mean it in business. We are at a really, really, really scary moment in this country, and it's going to get way darker, way faster. And independent journalism has never been more important. And I am the biggest believer in local, because I do believe that people are going to turn into their communities, because that is where all of the harms are going to be most directly felt. And that is where the stories are that need to be told. And so we have to break out of the old models that are not reaching and informing enough of the public quickly enough. And so be creative, be disruptive, be innovative, be entrepreneurial, but continue to do the good work that is why we all got into this, which is to inform the public, to keep them engaged so we can keep a country and a democracy that tries and strives constantly to increase the rights and protections and freedoms of all Americans, because that is not where we are today. And it's going to be the bravest content creators and journalists that get us out of this mess if we get out of it.
Always be an investigator. Always be an investigator, even if that's not your job. Look for the truth. Look for the best way to present the truth. Investigate the delivery just as much as you investigate the content. Be someone who is constantly learning. Don't take no for an answer, whether that's from a political official or from someone who says you can't try a thing. We need to try things, and we need to do it on the local level. So be an investigator in your backyard, be an investigator in your community, investigate your local library, no matter how much Seth says they trust it, investigate.
Thank you both so much. Thank you.